Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and I got so many wonderful reactions from listeners to my previous episode all about the dogs of Agatha Christie. Woof woof. But I'm going to let those responses marinate for a bit, because I imagine I'll get a few more, and I am just so excited about today's episode. I want to get right to the interview that I conducted with Kate Gingold, author of Agatha Annotated, a book that I think is going to interest many, if not all, of you. I just have to note up top here that Kate will be appearing at the Agatha Christie Festival in September in Torquay in England. So this is a little sneak peek at what she'll be talking about there. If you like what you hear and you're planning to attend the festival, I've included a link to Kate's talk specifically in the show notes so that you can buy yourself a ticket. Now, here comes my disclaimer as to spoilers in this episode. The following titles will be spoiled to some degree: The Body in the Library, Dead Man's Folly, and The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Forewarned is forearmed, so there you go. Also, special thank you to friend of the podcast, Tony Medower, who is a nexus for so many of us agathologists out there, the bedrock holding us all together. It was Tony who introduced me to Kate and made this interview happen. So let's get to it. My guest today is the author Kate Gingold, who has written a new book called Agatha Annotated, Investigating the Books of the 1920s. This book is written in the form of a glossary with every possible word or phrase you might come across and be unsure about in Christie's books from the 1920s, elucidated and contextualized for your readerly edification. It's truly an encyclopedic glossary covering everything from the meaning of the French phrases Poirot mutters to himself to the history behind all the various references Christie makes, true crime cases, past wars or other historical periods, authors and artists she liked, hotels where she may have stayed, etc., etc., etc. When you start looking, these references are basically endless, which is something that we have definitely dealt with over the course of this podcast. And that is why this book covers only the 1920s. The glossary is also punctuated by these mini essays that add color and detail to various aspects of Christie's work and the mystery genre overall. Topics such as World War I in Belgium and on the home front, the shifting state of domestic service over time, London's Limehouse district in the 1920s. I really enjoyed that one. And much, much more. Really fascinating stuff, especially for Christie fanatics such as us. And I cannot wait to get into all of it. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you, Kemper. I'm really excited to be here.
So I know that you've written a few historical novels, actually, sort of educational novels meant more for children to learn about what it was like to live in the past. And I'm curious, as an author, how you went from that to this massive undertaking involved in annotating Christie's novels of the 1920s. How did this come about?
Well, way back when I was in college, I always thought I wanted to write and illustrate children's books. And I didn't for many, many years. And the first history novels or history books were for children because the town we lived in was having their 175th anniversary. And there was no children's book about the founding of the town. And I thought that was something important that there should be. So I, dusted off my skills and put together the history book. And I found that I really enjoyed writing and talking about history. And somebody said, well, what are you going to do about Lincoln? What are you going to do about this? And so I kind of snowballed into more history things. But I've always been an Agatha Christie fan, always. And many years ago now, I was reading the Agatha Christie, one of the Agatha Christie books, and I thought, gee, I wonder what that is. I should go look it up. And I did. And I wonder what that reference is. And I looked that one up. And eventually I started thinking, I bet there's other people just like me who are reading these and going, I wonder what that is. I've read this book 3 or 4 times and I always skipped over it. And now it's staring me in the face and I should look it up. So I started doing it seriously to note all the Agatha Christie references and look them up.
That's really great. And I think what I love most about this project is that it's rewarding a close reading of Christie. I mean, you're obviously reading Christie extremely closely if you are bothering to think about and then look up all of these various terms, but that makes for a much more enriching reading experience. And we've talked a lot on this podcast, myself and my former partner, Catherine Brobeck, who passed away. We talked for years about the fact that there are so many different ways to read Christie. And there's the surface reading, which is, what a lot of people do when they read Christie, or maybe when they first read Christie, especially if they're reading her at a younger age. And the mystery itself sort of exists on that surface level. But so often when we engage in a deeper read, we can see that she is engaging in social commentary herself and just drawing on her knowledge as a person in the world, as an intelligent and curious and sophisticated person in the world, who I'm not going to say was, the most well-read person of her age, but I think was emblematic of her age when people were really well-read and just were drawing on a lot of cultural artifacts and just general knowledge. And I think she put all of that into her books, and her books are so much of their time that if you do start investigating, there's a lot there, and a lot that we as readers now over 100 years after she first started publishing aren't going to get without a book like this.
I think it's kind of fun to read it as her contemporaries were reading them, because they did know a lot of these references. I mean, obviously not everybody knew everything, but a lot of them were familiar to everybody who was reading her work at the time.
Yeah, and that always makes me feel closer to the text and to the author if I can sort of situate myself as someone who's reading contemporaneously, right? If I can imagine, this is more what it was like to read, The Man in the Brown Suit in 1924 or any of these various books. And that's really great. I love that you make that process certainly a lot easier, because as you said, I mean, you were just going in and looking up item by item, and I've totally done that too. I've done that for this podcast, and I think it's really great to have one text that's covering this whole decade, where when you come across something you don't know, you can go look it up in your book, and the book is organized alphabetically. So any term within any of those books from the 1920s, all you have to do is go into your book and consult it like an index, right? And you'll be able to find it because you can dip in and read that entry and then leave it again. And the next time you come across something that you don't know, you go back in. I mean, is that how you imagine people reading the book? Because you also then do have these mini essays. So it's a little bit of two different ways, I think, to read the book, cover to cover and dipping in and dipping out.
Well, yeah. And I kind of based that on, there's a book out there called What Jane Austen Ate and Charles Dickens Knew.
Oh, I love that book. Yes. Yes.
And I read that one cover to cover many times. And it's just, sometimes it is just fun to go in and just, spend a little time. Like people used to read encyclopedias, instead of Google searching this specific item, you would look at everything kind of around that page and go, oh, I didn't know about that. And oh, that's interesting. I never even thought to look that up, that kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's interesting. And I did want to ask you about just your methodology overall, because I'm always curious about an author's methodology, whether it be in fiction or nonfiction. And I'd love to know how you went about figuring out the terms that you were going to define for your books. Like, did you just underline anything that confused you or that you wanted to know more about? And then I'd also love for you to talk about how you actually went about defining these terms, how you did your research.
Well, in the beginning, we were traveling and I had taken a couple of Agatha Christie's with me, and I just started scribbling notes as I was reading. I had the book in one hand and a notebook on my lap and a pen in the other hand, and just started scribbling words I didn't know as I was reading. And then I'd go back, and a lot of them, are just definitions. You can just look up the definition. That's pretty easy. And then some were fairly easy to Google or read in a book and to find them. But some of them were extremely challenging. And I started this in 2017, something like that. And in 2020, of course, we were all at home by ourselves. Yep. And so I started spending more time talking to people who had time in museums or in clubs or societies, and they were all home too. And they couldn't always tell me the answer because they couldn't get back into the museum or get back into their archives, but they could pass me along to other people who might be able to answer. And it was was quite fun to build up quite a camaraderie of and fellowship with all these people all over the world who knew things about trains or bathhouses or financial banking in the 1920s. It was really fascinating experts.
Yeah, I'm with you on, the joy of building up a community of like-minded people, because it's a little bit like we're all obsessed, we're all addicted to the same thing, and often don't have people in our regular lives who share that passion.
Right. Right. This is true.
Obviously, you're American. This book is available in the United States. Is this book available outside of the United States as well? Is this something that people can access worldwide?
Yes, it is. Through Amazon, it is. I was very, very careful about trying to make sure I had every bibliographic reference, perfectly right. And I had rights to use the things I used and, made sure I acknowledged all the people I wanted to acknowledge. It's very important to me that it's accessible and not restricted because it's only available in the United States or whatever.
Right, which I assume is, I know that there are other annotated Agatha Christie novels out there that are available in the United States, but due to UK copyright issues, if you had annotated the actual novels and then, tried to republish the novels here, that is something that others have done, others who have been on this podcast, actually. Right. But this is something different in that you're publishing a separate text that is commenting on, those novels. So you're not engaging in any republication, which means you can, the book is accessible worldwide.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And, there's room for so many different projects within the world of Agatha Christie scholarship, right?
I have to agree with that.
I just wanted to give listeners a sense of what you do in this book. So I wanted to highlight a few entries now and just discuss them a little bit. The first one has to do with Cleo, the champagne, because there's this reference in The Man in the Brown Suit to Cleo 1911. And I just wanted to read it out, actually, because it's an excuse to revisit the diary of Sir Eustace Pedlar, which is such charming text within one of my favorite novels of Christie's from the 1920s. And Sir Eustace is saying here in his diary, "Then we went down to supper. I had ordered champagne. The steward suggested Cleo 1911 as being the best they had on the boat, and I fell in with his suggestion." And so reading that, what a reader could do is say, Cleo 1911, what does that even mean? Because it's certainly not explained any further. And going now to Kate's book, here is your entry on Cleo 1911. I'm just going to read it out. "This champagne house was founded by Philippe Cleo in 1772, but made famous by Philippe's daughter-in-law, who took over the business when her husband, the heir, died young. Unusual for a woman at the time, Madame Cleo kept the house producing during the Napoleonic Wars, and in 1814 she made the shrewd marketing move of sending champagne to Grand Duke Michael Pavlovich of Russia to toast Napoleon's defeat. He loved it, and sales soared across Europe. Originally a very sweet champagne, Cleo was the first house to offer champagne vintages, so one could choose a Cleo 1911. And that's just, not even a very long entry, but wow, you packed a whole bunch of really interesting facts there into a very short paragraph about Cleo 1911. I think that's really great. Like, how did you come across all that information and just kind of compact it in that way? I think that's really impressive.
Well, Cleo has their own information online for their own history, but there are a lot of champagne experts who talk about this kind of thing, and particularly how different champagne is today than it was back in those days. And I think the fact that it's a vintage, has a date on it, it makes Sir Eustace, you realize he's even more wealthy than you expected because he can order this very special champagne.
Yeah, no, I mean, it certainly enhances the read. And this is for people who, as I said, are looking for a deeper read here. And just like there's just, I think, a general spirit of curiosity that I really appreciate in this book overall. So the next one I just wanted to highlight has to do with this poem, Heartbeats, because this is one of the places in which I think you sort of call out Christie for making a little bit of an error, right?
Yeah, there's a couple of places where I think it's because she didn't have Google. She couldn't look it up. So she was probably relying on her memory.
Exactly, because Poirot and Hastings are talking to each other, and they're referencing the English poets and this poem having to do with heartbeats, and they mention the Brownings, Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but actually the poem that they're referencing probably is not by the Brownings, but is by Philip James Bailey. And you go into this in the book, and then you quote the poem at length, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think in a way it shows Agatha Christie's, well, I'm not going to say erudition since she was technically wrong, but the fact that she was making these references from memory. I mean, she was doing this as a person who was just generally familiar with poetry. And when she was writing, she was sort of doing this off the cuff because she didn't have Google. And often her editors weren't really checking up on her, which is, how sometimes we have these errors that made it through the text. And I think there's something charming and kind of old world, old school about that. But I also like the fact that you're giving us this greater context so that we can be aware that, there is a slight error in here, and where does that poem actually come from? I think that's really cool.
Well, I like to imagine that Agatha Christie as a child was sitting in a library at home, or maybe in a library of a place she was visiting, and pulled a couple of books off of the shelves and read through them at some point. Maybe it was raining, she couldn't go outside, so she read whatever books were there. And I just picture her reading all these old poems and old manuscripts and old stories, and they're all jumbled up in her brain. And, she didn't have Google to look up and confirm that the quote was correct or not. But so, she might have misremembered it. But I think it's kind of fun to think of her as a child just accumulating all this knowledge and all this literature.
No, definitely. I think, again, it sort of just enhances, our overall understanding of who Christie is as a person and an author. I think all these little bits of contextualization really help. I also wanted to highlight your entry on spills and spill vases, because this is one that actually really does help with just the understanding of the mystery within the Mysterious Affair at Styles. And actually, this is something that Catherine and I had a hard time with in our first episode, because we had no idea what spills are. I mean, longtime listeners will know exactly what spills are, because it was a bit of a journey that we took on this, aided by other listeners. But, they're twisted up bits of paper that are used to light a fire. And I won't spoil the Mysterious Affair at Styles on this episode. It's not necessary, but they are key to the solving of the crime, or at least an understanding of them is key to the solving of the crime, because they're actually used to conceal something quite important in that book. So I could have really used this book while I was reading The Mysterious Affair at Styles, for example.
Well, that's fun. Would you have thought to look it up then?
I think so. I mean, that's the other thing. I think there are definitely some terms in here where readers might be confused by a reference that they don't know, but sometimes it's like you don't know what you don't know.
And I've heard from people who say, "Oh, these are really easy. I knew what that was. Why do you have to write that one down?" But there's always somebody who doesn't know. I mean, I believe in the no dumb questions thing. You can't assume everybody knows everything.
I totally agree. And I also think that's actually a reason why, I think you could read this book in more of a cover to cover way, because it's just fun. It was fun for me anyway, as a Christie superfan, to get this kind of like overview sense of the books of the 1920s and jump around from book to book as I was going through all of these terms in alphabetical order. And then that way you do come across perhaps items that, you don't know everything about them, or you thought you understood what she meant, but actually, there was this historical context that you had, no understanding of, or something like that. So yeah, I mean, there are definitely two different ways, I think, to read a book like this. I thought you gave some really interesting contextualization of the teddy bear, which also features in that same excerpt of Eustace Pedler's diary. But you get into the Teddy Roosevelt of it all, and how the teddy bear became associated with him because he was known for big game hunting. And there's this story, which I have to imagine, it might be somewhat apocryphal, but he was the only member of a hunting party who hadn't shot a bear. So he had staffers sort of located a bear and tied it to a tree for him, but he refused to shoot it because that felt unsportsmanlike. So for that, in that way, he almost became this hunter, became like a champion of bears and associated with, the cute, cuddly teddy bear. That's really fun as well.
Some of these stories, some people know them, but not everybody has heard these stories before. So it's fun to commit it to paper so that they don't get lost.
Yes, because I agree. I mean, so much of this, I think, are, just little bits and pieces of cultural capital, you could almost call it, just things that Christie was probably assuming we know as readers. And because she has stood the test of time to the extent that she has, those little bits and pieces, the ephemera of cultural knowledge is going to just fall away with the passing of each year. So this is a way of sort of anchoring us to that time, which I really appreciate. I just want to talk a little bit about the mini essays that you wrote as well, and they're sort of peppered throughout the book. In one of them, you gave a historical context for the reason we have so many dithering socialist characters in Christie. Catherine and I often called them the angry young male socialist, because often it would be this young man who was an idealistic whippersnapper who's secretly an heir, or at least all too willing to assume a rich lifestyle once he's given the chance. And you put Bundle Brent, Lady Eileen Brent from The Secret of Chimneys and the Seven Dials mystery, in this category. You called her a champagne socialist, which, as you say, is a member of the landed gentry, or, in her case, even the upper aristocracy, perhaps, who espouses socialist ideals. She talks the talk, but she doesn't walk the walk. And what I thought was really interesting about the essay that you wrote is that you placed this portrayal specifically within the context of what was happening in Europe at the time, and to be even more specific, of what was happening in Russia, the class upheaval that was viewed with such horror by many in England. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, we bandy those words about today as well, but they have the actual definitions or the connotations of them have changed a little bit. And specifically back then, the people in England who did have land, did have wealth, and did have, the social hierarchy there, they viewed Russia, it could happen to them. And, obviously the king and his family were all shot, and everything was distributed amongst the populace. So they had a very specific fear that it would happen in England. And I think that's pretty much closed off any warmer feelings, because communism and socialism, they have some warm feelings in them, because the whole idea is to help people. And there was a large group of wealthy people in the generation before that, like the late 1800s, who said, let's not make children 10 years old work in factories. How about if we educate them? How about if people didn't live in poverty? Wouldn't that be great? So I think some of that was kind of strangled off after the Russian Revolution to some extent.
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting that, it's a pointed disparagement that you find, I think, in these books, where underneath it, there is a fear of, if socialism really takes off and goes in the wrong direction, that's, horrible things might happen. And often these characters are figures of fun in these Christie books, but behind it is something very real and, taken very seriously. I think that's something too. It's a historical context that you need told to you to really appreciate it. You're not going to get that context from the books because it's entirely subtextual.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, they are kind of taken as lighter characters, and we all love Bundle. I mean, well, she's a lovable person.
That's a perfect seamless segue into my next question, Kate, because I was thinking as I read your book that I've never really come across a book that focuses on Christie's novels from the 1920s alone. And I realized that you had to break things up here since you're going so deep on each of these texts that if you bit off a larger chunk than a single decade, the book would get way too long very quickly. It's of reasonable length at this point, just in the 1920s, but it would be double that if you had done the 20s and 30s, for example.
Right. Oh, there's a lot of books in the 30s.
Yeah, that's true. You know what? You're right. It actually would have been probably triple. But I can't help wondering how you, as a Christie fan who has now spent so much time with the books of the 1920s alone, feel about these novels, which aren't often considered among Christie's best. And I'll just be upfront about it, address the elephant in the room. Perhaps it's a handful of elephants. Did you hate The Secret of Chimneys as much as I did, or The Big Four as much as Catherine did? I think there are a bunch of clunkers within these books of the 1920s, and they're usually not among fan favorites. But I'm curious how you feel about them and if you feel differently after spending as much time with them as you did.
I've thought about this because knowing that I was going to talk with you and knowing how you and Catherine have dissected the works before, I do not come to it from the point of view of let's look at the literature. I look at the history. And so I really enjoyed The Secret of Chimneys because I enjoyed the historic aspects of it. I really enjoyed Lord Caterham and talking about the chic and lovemaking, which isn't even in some of the newer versions, because it's interesting bits of history. As literature, I will leave that to you and Catherine. And I don't think anybody is really thrilled with the Big Four, including Agatha Christie. So I'm not sure that can even be put in the same category.
Yeah, that's interesting. If you're coming from, the perspective of a historian, perhaps that is the best perspective with which to approach some of these novels from the 1920s. And I think that's really true, especially about The Secret of Chimneys. I revisited it recently for the podcast, and it did get bumped up a few spots, not many, but a few spots in the rankings. And the references just fly fast and furious in that book to so many different things because it's such a chatty book, and people are that is just Christie, I think, spouting whatever came into her mind as she was writing that book. That's really interesting from a historical perspective. So I think that that's fair. And it is certainly, she wrote so many different types of books within the 1920s, because this is when she really was experimenting with the thriller format. But obviously, you have more of her classic puzzle mystery format, even in her very first book. And you even have one crown jewel in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd from 1926. So it must have been nice actually to have a little bit of a mixed bag there when it came to form and what Agatha Christie did over the course of her career.
Yeah, and I'm sure it was fun for her to try different things too. I mean, there may have been pressure from her editors, bring out the same thing you did because that's what people like, or bring out something like this person because that's what people are buying. But, she must have decided to try things maybe for monetary reasons or maybe for creative reasons and see what sips out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, she was experimenting, and it was the beginning of her career, and she was figuring out what she wanted to do and what worked. And I think that too, I mean, there's kind of a contextualizing that needs to happen to really understand those 20s thrillers, because they made a lot more sense within the marketplace of the 20s. There were a lot of other people who were writing stories like that, and most of them have not stood the test of time. Hers have, because she's Agatha Christie. I mean, I would argue because of some of her other novels, which are absolute masterpieces of the 20th century. I don't think that The Secret of Chimneys or The Seven Dials Mystery or The Big Four or even The Secret Adversary are masterpieces of the 20th century, but they're written by Agatha Christie. So for that reason, they will never go out of print and people will continue to read them. But I think, lifting them out of that context of thrillers within the 20s, that's where it really is helpful, to get this sense of where they came from and the period that they came out of. And you deal with that a lot. I mean, you even write about all the different fads and crazes of the 1920s, and the detective, novel, detective fiction was one of those. It obviously stuck around for a lot longer than like flagpole sitting did, say, but there was a little bit more meat on the bones of detective fiction than flagpole sitting, but it still did, it was approached, I think, with that same fervor in the moment. So, that's where a novel like The Secret of Chimneys just makes a bit more sense.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Well, I really love, by the way, that you do all of the French expressions that appear in the book, because that is something, especially when I was a kid, that would sometimes befuddle me. And I would just skip over it too. I'd be like, I can kind of understand what he's saying, but I love that you really do translate all of even the rudimentary French expressions that Poirot uses. And you have actually, for the entry on parbleu, I had never heard of this term before, but it's so delightful. I just have to share it. That is a minced oath. Because the bleu, which, it literally means by the blue, but of course the bleu just rhymes with Dieu. So it's meant to mean by God. And since the bleu is substituting there for Dieu, that makes it a minced oath, which I just think is such a great term.
Isn't it fun?
Yeah, it's really, really fun. Do you think on the whole that Christie's French is good?
Oh, I don't speak French, so I really can't answer that exactly. I had a French person that I was working with, and it was interesting because a lot of the times they would translate something for me and say, oh, it means like if you were saying, oh my God, or whatever, but that's not, then you wouldn't get the minced oath part if you didn't, actually take it apart.
Yep.
And so I'm not really sure that her French is really that French, because I think even the French people were starting to not use minced oaths very much too.
Right. One of my favorite, I think what I would in American English, or maybe people say this in the UK also, but the way that some people say sugar, that strikes me as a minced oath in American English. We all know what that word was starting as, but then it ended much more innocuously.
Exactly. Or dash it all. That's one of my favorites.
Yes. Yeah, that's in the book as well, I think, right?
Yeah, because people, when they printed books, they didn't want to write the word damn it in there. So they would put a D and a dash. And so people just started using that as the epithet.
The actual dash.
Yeah.
That's so funny. That's great. I wanted to talk for a second about something that you call presentism in the book. And that's actually a term that I hadn't heard before reading your book, which is surprising because I think Catherine and I have dealt with the notion of presentism a lot on this podcast, though we just never referred to it that way. And I'll quote from you here. Presentism says that applying a modern day outlook to history is a distortion that affects true understanding of the period. In other words, as long as everyone, and you have everyone in quotation marks, as long as everyone back then held the same values, that was normal for the time and shouldn't be judged using today's values. And you're talking about this in the book in the context of The Man in the Brown Suit specifically, which is a book that is very much stuck in its time. I've actually heard from listeners, and specifically even listeners in South Africa, who have given me a greater understanding of how deeply the book really is stuck in its time and problematically, I think, for a lot of readers. And it felt to me when you were talking about presentism and the issue of reading these books in the modern day, you didn't really come out on either side of this issue. It's not like you were arguing. So we cannot in any way whatsoever have any problem with anything that Christie said because she was just writing in her own day. I mean, that would be a strictly presentist kind of reading of her book. And if you go completely on the other end, you would just condemn Christie utterly for not having 21st century or whatever happens to be the present day in which we're speaking, for not having the sensibilities, the latest sensibilities. I would just love to hear from you, like how you negotiate this issue as a reader of Christie, and whether, after having, I think, approached these books from the 1920s from a historical perspective, as you have, many of them having, these issues, I'd say perhaps even more so than a lot of Christie's books from other decades, because she did evolve as people evolved on some of these issues to what feels to us like more of a modern sensibility. I'm just wondering, like, where you come out on this issue and how you negotiate it both as a reader and a researcher.
I struggle back and forth on it, but my main thought is, that if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So just whitewashing something, which is already a term I shouldn't even be using. You can't change everything and then pretend everything was fine back then, because I think that we should face what was behind us and decide to make this, what we're going to do from here on in. And we're going to always do that from wherever we are. But I also think you can enjoy books that are problematic to us today. And I was thinking about it the other day. I was thinking about, because the new season of Bridgerton had started, and I was thinking there was a lot of bad stuff in that era, but we're picking out the parts that we're having fun with. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that either, as long as we remember there are parts of history that we are not proud of and that we don't want to repeat. But I don't think we have to pretend they never happened either. And I do think that knowing what presentism is, then each reader can make their own decision too as they read it and go, okay, I can get beyond this. I can enjoy the parts that I want to enjoy, and the other parts are not going to ruin that enjoyment for me. Or they can look at it and say, nah, I just can't do it. I was reading some Roald Dahl not too long ago. I can't read Charlie in the Great Glass Elevator. I couldn't get through that without feeling bad about it. But there are other things I do like about Roald Dahl. So, I think you have to make your personal decisions sometimes too.
Yeah, I joke more is more in the world of Agatha Christie, but I honestly think that's sort of my same approach to this as well, which is I always want those original texts to be there, because if we revise the texts and then the revised texts are the only ones that are available to us, we lose some of that ephemera and we lose some of what you're celebrating in this book and what you're really trying to anchor on the page. And I think that would be such a huge shame, even if some of those references or, treatments are quote unquote problematic to us today. But I also can completely understand doing some revisions. I just don't think there's a hard and fast rule. It's not like, okay, so that means we can never do anything. There's no text should ever be revised. And I always bring up, people have heard me say this so many times on this podcast, but I always bring up the fact that Christie's book, And Then There Were None, and we all know what the original UK title of that book was. Right. That book was retitled for an American audience in 1939 in Christie's own lifetime. And you certainly didn't hear her railing about that in letters. And that's something that was done then. And I think sometimes people like to pretend that they're in the one period where certain things are happening. And these are issues that I think people have grappled with forever, and we continue to grapple with them. We just have the internet to all freak out about it at all times of the day and night. That's the difference.
Well, like the quote you were using before about how I said everyone is in quotes, because not everyone believed, in some of the things that were happening in the 1920s. There were definitely enlightened people back then too.
Yeah, I think presentism is an oversimplification, and I don't even know what to call its opposite. I'll just say wokeism, for lack of a better term. I mean, wokeism also is an oversimplification. And I think, the answer lies in just kind of having to accept the muddle and figure it out as we go along. I mean, I'm certainly okay with And Then There Were None being retitled and all of those references with that word, which are just littered throughout the original text. I'm very happy that I never had to read that original text. But then I definitely want to be able to read My Lord Edgeworth Dies with all of the horrific anti-Semitic stuff in it. And at least have the ability to read that as it was originally written. But I can also understand someone wanting to read it because they're casually reading it without those horrific anti-Semitic remarks in it. So it's just complicated. I think we read for different reasons. I just think with Christie, as a scholar of Christie, and you're a scholar of Christie, what a shame it would be if our access to those original texts were ever completely cut off. And I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I would like confirmation that would never happen. I don't think I've still gotten that confirmation to make me as comfortable with some of the revision that's happened in recent years. If I had confirmation as to the availability of those original texts, it would make me feel a lot better. But I understand where some of those revisions are coming from. I just think it's a complicated issue.
I agree. And I think, was it a year ago or so when they were revising the Roald Dahl books, and then at the last minute or something they decided, we're going to issue both the old ones and the revised ones.
Exactly.
And at the time I thought, okay, well, that could be a good thing. You know, they're doing it for the betterment of readers, or it could just be a marketing decision. They can sell twice as many books. I don't know. but either way, it's a good idea.
Either way, it's a good idea. More is more.
There you go.
Well, I have to ask you, Kate, what is your favorite Christie novel? And you mentioned a little bit how you have always been a Christie reader, but like, what is your Christie origin story? I mean, how did you first come to Christie, and do you have a favorite novel among the canon?
Okay, well, I read my first Agatha Christie, and then there were none. I read that as a Girl Scout. It was part of a reading badge, and the leader had picked that book for us to read. So that was the first one I ever read. And then for years after that, my mom and I would go to garage sales, and everybody had, Agatha Christie novels for a dime or whatever. So I started collecting them at that point.
How old were you when you read that for Girl Scouts? I'm just curious.
Maybe 12, something like that. I wasn't a super young introduced to Agatha Christie. And then and this is just a really weird side story, but there was one I came across at a garage sale that I hadn't read before in my 20s. And so I put it away because I was pregnant, and I thought, I'll take this one to the hospital with me, and it'll be a brand new one that I've never read before, and it'll keep me busy during, those hours and hours of labor they kept threatening me with. But as it turned out, I didn't need it, and I didn't read it.
Which one was that? I
don't even remember anymore. I suspect it was Endless Night, because I came to that one very, very late.
Got it.
But I really don't remember.
And that's a pretty dark one too. So maybe it was for the best that you did.
Yeah, I'm glad I didn't read it. It's one of the ones that I don't reread very often because it's just disturbing.
I agree. That's one that I think is not high on my reread list either. And do you have a favorite overall?
Well, I started thinking about that because I know you were bound to ask that question. And I think I've decided that I prefer The Body in the Library. And I think it's because it's a typical great house story, mystery. But the thing that I thought was really compelling to me is that Miss Marple is talking to, Dolly Bantry, and it takes Dolly a while to figure out that this is not a game, that this is really affecting her husband. And there's something about that one that really strikes me.
Yeah, I love the relationship between Dolly and Colonel Bantry, actually.
Yeah.
They're great characters, and there's some serialization there too. I mean, they definitely are series-long characters.
Right. And then when she moves to the lodge, it's kind of like, oh, that's sad.
My final question, and I did give you a heads up on this, so you knew this was going to come, Kate, but I torture almost everyone who appears on the podcast by making them choose between Poirot and Marple. And, given the fact you've done this book focusing on the 1920s, I know there's no Miss Marple here, there's only Poirot, but I have to imagine that you are going to write more of these books having to do with future decades of Christie's work. So perhaps you could speak to that first and then answer that age-old question of Poirot or Marple.
Okay. Well, I am working right now on the 1930s. And like I said, there are a lot of books in the 1930s. I'm hoping, though, I've already added some to my research database, and some of them repeat. So I just have to add the reference of where it shows up in the book because I've already defined the word. But there's going to be a lot of research coming up too, but that's what I'm working on now. And as far as Marple versus Poirot, I like the Poirot novels for the history aspects because he gets out more. He travels, he hangs out in big houses with important people. And so I love the history bits that come out of there. But I have to say, especially as I become older, I think I identify much more with Miss Marple. So I'm going to say Miss Marple.
I love that. Yes. I feel like we all identify with Miss Marple because she's the ultimate sort of human investigator, and she relies so much on instinct and an understanding of the intimate relations between people. And I didn't think about that though, but from a historical perspective, I suppose there's a bit more to chew on in an obvious way in the Poirot novels, although she really does get down and dirty as to domesticity in the Miss Marples. And I'm sure there's a lot to uncover there as to, how is a household actually run, the evolution of domestic help, which you touch on in the book in the 20s, but I'm sure you'll be coming back to that a whole lot in future books covering future Christie novels. So I have to imagine there's a lot to cover in a book like The Murder at the Vicarage, for example.
That's true. Looking forward to it.
And you're going to do all of the short story collections from the 1930s as well in that book?
I don't know yet. I started with my research with Parker Pine, so maybe I will.
I mean, that's I think what makes the 1930s such a huge decade. I mean, there's a ton of novels, but she also published a bunch of book collections. I mean, in this first book, you just have Poirot Investigates and Partners in Crime, but in the 1930s, I mean, there's just an explosion.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I am obviously really looking forward to that book on the 1930s, and hopefully you will be doing books on the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and maybe even the 70s.
We'll see.
But I do obviously encourage others to check out this book. And how, if people are interested in getting in touch with you or learning more about you, Kate, what is the best way that they could do that?
Well, AgathaAnnotated.com is where I blog regularly, where you can subscribe to the database and get all the same information that's in the book, but it would be online. And there's other things that go on at that website. I have a newsletter. I send out one term from the book a week.
Ooh, that's fun.
Word of the Week, Wednesday. And so that's mainly where I'm also on, Facebook and some other places, but my website, Agatha Annotated, is the main place.
All right. Fantastic. Yeah, you can go there and it sounds like access a whole bunch of stuff. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Kate. I really appreciate it. And congrats on the book.
Oh, thank you so much, Kemper. And congrats on your book.
Thank you. This didn't occur to me till I was editing the episode, but I wonder if there's any connection between the fact that Kate first started reading Agatha Christie for a Girl Scout badge and then went on to choose The Body in the Library as her favorite Christie. Some Freudian food for thought there. If I'd thought of it in the moment, I would have asked her what she thought of Dead Man's Folly as well. Anyway, thank you again to Kate Gingold for sitting down with me and talking at length about her fascinating book. I can't wait for more of these Agatha Annotated books by Kate to come out in the future. I will lap up every single one of them. I have provided a link to Kate's website, agathaannotated.com, in the show notes, which will take you to her book and to that database she mentioned, which I should note involves a subscription fee that gets you all sorts of goodies in addition to what's included in the book. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, I've also provided a link to Kate's talk at this year's Agatha Christie Festival in September in Torquay. I am not providing a link to my panel at the festival, as online tickets are now officially sold out. But as I did last year, I will be recording the episode, so you should all be able to experience it in one form or another. And for my next episode, I'm going to be airing a summer rerun that will do double duty as a little bit of preparation for my festival panel. So my panel will be devoted to the crowning of the greatest screen adaptation of an Agatha Christie story. And once again, I am not doing this alone. Oh, not by a long stretch. I will be joined by John Curran, Mark Aldridge, Teresa Peschel, and Victoria Dowd. All people who you have heard me speak about on this podcast before. I've had John, Mark, and Teresa on the podcast itself, and Victoria has also been on the podcast because she appeared in last year's panel at the festival. So I'm very excited to talk all about Agatha Christie films and television episodes and which among the panoply available to us we are going to crown as the greatest. We're going to do another balloon debate where we whittle it down, and then the audience will decide between our number 2 and our number 1 pick. It's going to be so much fun, and I know that because this is the same format that we have used for the last 2 All About Agatha panels at the festival. So I figured it would be fun to air a previous episode devoted to screen adaptations of Christie, and I landed on one that we first aired 6 years ago, almost to the day. In August of 2018, my former partner, the eternally missed Catherine Brobeck, and I sat down virtually with Dr. Mark Aldridge, and we discussed all of the English language adaptations of And Then There Were None, as well as one very notable Russian language adaptation. And who knows, maybe one of those adaptations will be under discussion at the festival in September. So that is what I'll be airing next week. Honestly, it's always nice to hear from Catherine on this podcast, to hear her voice beyond those ratings and review ads that I insert into present day episodes. So I'm really looking forward to that. Hope you are too. As always, please reach out to me. I love hearing from listeners. You can email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books, and you can still purchase my debut mystery novel, The Busybody. I have provided links in the show notes for purchase in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia and New Zealand. We have gotten some great ratings and reviews in recently, and it warms my heart whenever I see them. So please, please, please keep them coming wherever you are in the world and on whatever platform you are listening to this podcast. We want to expand the Agatha-loving audience as far and wide as possible. All right, speak soon. Bye.